See anything wrong in this video? If you answered yes, you might want to guess again. Everything you see here is technically tournament legal in the Capcom Pro Tour, but should it be? Hi, I'm Wireman. Maybe a little bit of cheating's allowed? Let me explain. If you look at that video again, this is evidently cheating, but there's nothing in the rules saying you can't do it. For the non-Street Fighter V players, what you're seeing here is an instantaneous V-shift, where the player is holding down one or more directions. This, in theory, shouldn't be possible, or at least it shouldn't be this easy. V-shift is a defensive mechanic in Street Fighter V that allows players to spend some of their V-meter, Street Fighter V's equivalent of a revenge meter, to get out of a situation. It could even reward you for that choice with damage and meter gain if you use it at the right time. On its own, this would make it a particularly strong option on defense. So in order to maintain balance, it can only be done when no directions are being pressed. It's a defensive option that you have to commit to, above all others if you want to use it. You can't opt for blocking, dashing or jumping while also hedging your bets by mashing the V-shift button. This makes the move fair in a few different ways. A charge character can't keep charging, you can't option select multiple defensive options at the same time as you do it, like you can with the game's other defensive mechanics like the V-reversal, and it would take a degree of execution to instantaneously go from walking or dashing or blocking into V-shifting out of harm's way in a single frame. And in a game where frame advantage is paramount, that can be the difference between getting away or getting counter hit. So how is this player getting away with it? Fortunately, the creator of this video published their own blog explaining how they did it, complete with instructions on how to do it yourself. They even boast about how it fits within the current tournament rules. What this player is doing is pushing a button that's mapped as a dedicated V-shift button, which is fine, button binds are fine, but it also disconnects all directional information by cutting the power to the direction buttons entirely, which is something not mentioned in the rules because up until now, killing the signal to half of your own controller doesn't sound like something you would need a rule for. I've recreated the circuit here, and you can see that while the button is not held, the controller behaves as normal. But when the V-shift button is pressed, all directions are ignored, even if they're already held down. There are a bunch of rules around what you can and can't do with input and directions, but nothing saying you can't deselect an input by pressing a button, which is what this is doing. It's not a button bind, because it's not creating two simultaneous inputs. It's not a macro, because it's not also creating two simultaneous outputs. It's removing an output. So should a rule come in to ban this? Well, this is where the problem really sits, because it's probably not that simple. The fighting game community has a lot of legacy when it comes to rules around custom controllers. The concept of bring your own controller, or BYOC, is at the heart of the FGC, and was one of the big catalysts in the development of early FGC culture. In the same way that the availability of the iconic Mad Catz Tournament Edition fight stick, along with the release of Street Fighter IV, created a renaissance in the 09er era, the generation before that mobilised by pooling all of their knowledge and hardware together to preserve arcade culture without the need for arcade machines. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the arcade scene in the Western world was dying, console gaming was taking over, and there was a real risk of the FGC fading away with the old guard due to arcade machines and arcades in general becoming scarce and expensive. The strain on running tournaments for a shrinking arcade scene was becoming a bigger and bigger burden. The BYOC rule allowed people to build, modify, or buy arcade sticks that would allow them to play on real arcade parts and layouts side by side with pad players via console, bringing together the console and arcade scenes on more affordable and more equal footing than ever before. Far better than the majority of the licensed arcade sticks at the time. This in turn drove higher turnouts, more events, more games, and even weird side tournaments, all with a less costly technical need, as players stuffed consoles and arcade sticks into their backpacks and ran events wherever they could plug in. When we talk about what makes the FGC different from other scenes, making things more diverse from an approachability level is one of those defining factors that's gotten us to where we are today. Allowing people to bring their own gear had its upsides and downsides, however. So a lot of trust and a handful of rules needed to be established to make sure things stayed fair, and as things have developed through those generations and into the current era, a lot of those rules have evolved specifically around directions being assigned to buttons, which is where a lot of the all-button controller skepticism comes in. Initially, customizing buttons to handle directions was done for quite pure reasons. People were mapping emulator controls to their MAME cabinets' internal keyboards, they were trying to play PC fighting games on their laptops while they were away from their setups, they were building these all-button controllers to ease the strain on their wrists. Some people just wanted something that fitted in their backpacks better, and the link hadn't been invented or stolen yet. People were effectively continuing the BYOC spirit of playing on what suited them and what they had available, and we've seen all kinds of weird creations emerge as a result. Since then though, we've seen controversies arise over adding directional buttons, particularly buttons that allow you to jump diagonally, additional jump buttons for instant air specials, additional dash buttons, and exploitation of the phenomenon caused by all of these things, known as simultaneous opposite cardinal direction logic, or SOCD logic. Right, hello, sorry, Future White Man here. I didn't realise I'm going to talk about SOCD logic quite a lot from this point forward going in the video. If you already know about that stuff, skip to this part in the video. For everyone else, before the invention of all button controllers, it was impossible to press left and right on either a joystick or a D-pad or anything like that. So fighting games didn't really have anything in place for what happens to your character when you press left and right at the same time. So it's not until you go to a hitbox or a keyboard that you find this problem. Like I said, I'm holding left, press right, right wins. Now, if I'm holding right and I press left, nothing happens. So there is no SOCD logic in Street Fighter 4 natively. This was really inconvenient, so people had to come up with ways to get around that, and something called SOCD cleaning became a thing. And what this does is if you can press left and right at the same time on your type of controller, it decides one of three outcomes. You can have a fixed output outcome, so if you press two buttons, one particular thing is guaranteed always to win. You can have a null outcome, where if you press these two buttons left and right at the same time, for example, nothing comes out. Or you can have what's called last win logic, which is where whichever button you pressed last wins outright over the two inputs. So for example, if you press left and then right, right would win. But if you press right and then left, left would win. Different games have different rules here, but for right now in the Capcom Pro Tour, if you press left and right at the same time, it should equal nothing. And if you press down and up, it can equal either nothing or always up. So that's that null and fixed outcome that it has to be set to. There's pros and cons to different types of logic there, but that's what Capcom's gone with. There's still some things that people with this stuff can do that normal Fightstick users can't do, but it does have some disadvantages as well. Sorry, back to the video. By and large, these controllers have been created for preference purposes, not for unsportsmanlike behaviour. But there has been a degree of bad faith thrown in here and there, with game developers, tournament organisers, pro players and stick manufacturers all weighing in on both sides of the argument when it comes to what's fair. Ultimately though, as great as the controversy may be for some product sales and for pros securing sponsorships, it often leaves other players wary of these unorthodox controllers. And as soon as this recent video emerged, rather than looking at the real issue of an input removing an output, people saw the style of controller and aimed all their anger once again at the all-button controllers in general. What's interesting here, and what a lot of people don't seem to realise, is that this mod is both legal and extremely easy to do on any kind of controller. To prove this, I've taken one of the aforementioned all-stock Tournament Edition Mad Catz controllers, as industry standard as you can get, and using only off-the-shelf parts and only cutting a single wire have made the mod without having to change the joystick or add additional buttons like the original modder did. Because of how easy this is, I don't really want to go into more detail on how I did it, but hopefully seeing a normal 8-button, 8-way fight stick doing the same trick proves the point. This is not an all-button controller issue, this is an issue with the definition of the rules. This gimmick uses a loophole that's been at least partially inspired by the many attempts that people have had to try and curb and control custom controllers. So just add more rules to make this one illegal as well, right? When FullSchedule notoriously turned up with a stick that had additional up forward and up back buttons, allowing his MVC3 Crimson Viper to carry out low altitude instant air burning kicks at final round 17, the controversy it caused and the changes in ruling it inspired around of button binds and button macros resulted in the creation of what we now often refer to as a cross-up style controller. When Daigo's last win SOCD logic infused and dash button loaded Gaffro box controller caused confusion at Combo Breaker 2019, a very similar debate broke out, resulting in almost the exact same output of the actual cross-up controller being born. Now, due to more debate and controversy around multiple input options, we're seeing further attempts at regulating inputs that are inspiring the next round of blurrier, harder to govern, harder to observe exploits and unfair advantages. And do you know who ultimately loses out? Not the cheaters. The people losing out are a majority of the people that aren't using these controllers for the occasional SOCD backdash or to sidestep when they shouldn't be, but are using them for ergonomics, preference and accessibility. Better interface between the player and their character is a good thing, and a lot of all-button controller users opt for all-button controllers simply so that they can access their characters as easily as you can, as consistently as you can, and for prolonged periods like you can, on your own preference of control. After all, if these $100 to $200 button boxes were so much better, why isn't everyone using them? Especially the competitive people that can afford it and are already spending more than that burning through fight pads or customizing their sticks beyond recognition. Surely this is where they should be investing. I asked this very question on Twitter, and it turns out that pad and stick players have very similar answers to all button controller users as for why they don't use the apparent cheat boxes. Their weapon of choice is based on preference, not rules. That said, cost was a factor for some people, and if part of this arms race does become that forking out more money over and over again for sticks that meet the rules but also grant an unfair advantage becomes a trend, and the rules keep adjusting, so the hardware keeps adjusting, the FGC is just going to become a more exclusive scene, where the people that can bankroll the hardware metagame win outright. At that point, what's the point in turning up with your pad or the stick that you saved up for? What's the point in open brackets when predominantly sponsored players are the only ones that can then keep up? Is the future of the FGC some weird physical form of pay to win, open only to rich kids with all the gear and no idea. Furthermore, adjusting the rules for every permutation of controller and controller setting is impossible. Attempting to regulate and reduce these options is bad for the preference of the players, exhaustive for the regulators, and flies completely in the face of the BYOC nature of the community that all of this has been propped up by. Not only that, so long as they continue to regulate, the longer that they actually choose to engage in the arms race against this invisible army of the modern community, who will always be ahead and only show off their secrets when they choose to, for example when they want to sell their own skills. To avoid this long-winded ruling in the CPT scrolls that continues to fan the flames could be simplified by just reducing it to its first line. Limited customization is permitted as long as fairness is maintained, with autonomy and discretion remaining in the hands of the players and the TOs. And this problem will continue to be what it is right now, just a rare discovery of an unfair advantage, rather than the opportunity for modders and manufacturers to sell their services. One other route that some games opt for is programmatically trying to inhibit these options through things like anti-cheatware, integral SOCD logic, and controller recognition. But even then, using Tekken as an example, it hurts the accessibility of the game by limiting the use of custom and adaptive controllers, as well as limiting remapping options, all things needed by the well-intentioned players, not just the cheaters. Furthermore, cheaters can still find a way around this. As a compromise, Tekken provides two types of SOCD logic to players through its own controller detection, where controller players are granted last win logic by default, and no logic is granted to keyboard players. But some smart PCB selection here, or the use of something like joy-to-key, is all that's needed to get around that. Effectively, if cheaters want to cheat, they will find a way to cheat. No rule and no software will stop that, whether it's a pad, stick, or a mixture of the two. The only people it stops are the people who genuinely need that flexibility. So, should the rules leave space for customization, even if it lets in cheaters? Kind of. But only if you promise not to cheat.